Welcome to the presentation on the City of Barrie's private tree bylaw. We'll start the presentation with an outline of what we're going to talk about over the next 20 minutes or so. We'll do a little bit of a background purpose of the current review of our city's tree bylaw, what our existing tree bylaw looks like, how it works, existing tree canopy cover in the City of Barrie, some of the impacts to tree canopy things that remove or add tree canopy to the city. I'll do a little bit of an overview of tree bylaws in Ontario, give some examples of different types of tree bylaws that are in effect across Ontario, and just a little bit of a conclusion and next steps within this process. Let's start with the purpose of this review. Council has directed staff to investigate revising the existing tree bylaw to include individual trees on all private properties in Barrie. The reason for the review has been as a result of pressures on our urban forest, particularly trees on private residential properties in Barrie, but also in other situations as well. The City of Barrie has had a private tree bylaw in place since 1990. It focuses on regulating the removal or injury of any tree on a private property that's part of an ecological woodlot. The ecological woodlot has to be 1/2 of an acre, 0.2 hectares, or in size or larger. Since 1990, the private tree bylaw has been revised 3 times, 2002, 2005, and 2014. A tree bylaw is one tool used by a municipality to protect and enhance the urban forest. It is important that the goal is clearly communicated to the public. For a tree bylaw to be successful, it needs to include public education component to raise awareness of the value of the urban forest, as the value of a healthy urban forest is often underestimated. Why is the City of Barrie concerned about trees on private properties? Well, it's always important to point out the many valued environmental benefits and services to the community that trees provide. They provide reduction in heat island effect, resulting in lower energy consumption in the summer, reduction in winter winds, resulting in lower energy consumption in the winter. They sequester greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, stabilization of slopes and natural areas, the rooting systems protect against erosion. They provide a provision for wildlife habitat and other ecological processes. And they obviously intercept and absorb rainfall, surface water flows, and improve the water cycle. Overall, reducing the cost of water management, stormwater management in the City of Barrie. Our existing tree bylaw, mainly focused on ecological woodlots and the functions and ecological services that they provide, does have an annual administration responsibility. Typically, in an average year, 10 to 12 tree removal permits are issued for subdivision and site plan developments. That number is certainly increasing with the current South End development. We typically issue 3 to 4 permits for single lot construction. For an example, pool installations, home additions, secondary suites. And often we will issue a permit each year, sometimes more than one, other years none. But for woodlot management would be defined as things where you're doing good forestry management practices, so thinning, harvesting, working under a forest management plan. Certainly with any municipal bylaw, there's always an enforcement aspect. We rely upon the professional services and support of the municipal law enforcement officers. Over the last 30 years, there's been approximately 25 non-compliance issues with our private tree bylaw. Unfortunately, 4 of which were probably in the last year. Most incidents of tree bylaw infractions result in voluntary restoration and replanting. Often the owner is either unaware or didn't think they required a permit in a certain situation. However, some investigations have resulted in court cases and charges being laid. Some negotiated settlements as well. Fines have been as high as $70,000 for very large areas of removals, and restoration orders as high as $64,000. As a result of the council-approved urban forest strategy, City of Barrie staff have been measuring and monitoring the current urban forest canopy across the City of Barrie. Currently, 30.5% of the City of Barrie's 10,000 hectare land base is covered by tree canopy. That information was measured via satellite imagery in 2018. Obviously, it has changed a little bit since 2018, but it will be probably reviewed in the next couple of years. An important note is that 71%, or a little over 2,100 hectares of the tree canopy is on private lands. This makes private landowners a primary provider of Barrie's green infrastructure, and obviously a very important partner with the City of Barrie to ensure that there is a healthy and widespread urban forest canopy. Urban forest canopy cover greatly varies by land use and even age of development. For example, the average tree canopy on industrial areas is 18%. This is not an unusual for any other municipality based on the type of use and land use. Comparably, residential averages about 26%, but is also greatly varied by the age of the development. So for example, in purple circled areas, the Allendale neighborhood general area, the age of that development has a lot more mature trees in it than the example on the further to the right in circled in yellow, younger development area. The trees are still young and growing, and that canopy really hasn't developed. With over 3,000 hectares of canopy area within the City of Barrie, ranging from trees growing on residential backyards and streets to forested areas with high numbers of trees per hectare. There are several factors that affect that canopy on an annual basis. One of those is just simply annual mortality due to natural causes. Trees have a natural lifespan, and there are trees on a constant basis dying just of old age. Using some simple mathematics, if we factored average density of trees within canopies, there's probably in the neighborhood of 5 million trees across the City of Barrie. So using an average lifespan of 80 years, bearing in mind that some species are much older and live longer to 200 plus years, like a red oak, while some species like basswood and poplar have a much shorter lifespan and probably average well under 40 years. Using those numbers, there's probably over 62,000 trees just dying of age decline each year. One of the more obvious and immediate impacts to urban canopy is land clearing for development. When there is forest on that developed area, there may be approximately 1,000 to 2,500 trees per hectare that are removed at the onset of the development. Obviously, down the line when the development gets planted and landscaped, some of that canopy does return depending on the development type and the density of planting. The City of Barrie's had more than its fair share of major storm events. Ice storms, tornadoes, high winds, and other major climate impacts can affect tree canopy within the City of Barrie. Typically, if we average out these storms and single events, we probably lose in the dozens to hundreds of trees each year as a result. Insects and diseases also cause an impact to urban canopy. Non-native insects like emerald ash borer and diseases like butternut canker cause significant harm to tree health and impact tree canopy. Emerald ash borer causes the loss of approximately 500 ash trees each year. Although a smaller impact to urban canopy, it certainly affects quality and health of trees within urban settings. Poor construction and maintenance practices, cutting of roots, burying of roots, poor maintenance practices like string trimming around the base of a tree, cutting the bark off the bottom of it. These are impacts that cause short and long-term impacts to tree health and the overall canopy. As I noted earlier, although it doesn't happen frequently, unauthorized tree removals, unnecessary removals of trees from woodlots is certainly an impact to urban canopy. If the trees aren't replanted, if the area isn't restored and regenerated, that can be a longer term loss of tree canopy. Well, I've mentioned quite a few negative impacts to urban forest canopy. There certainly are a number of positives as well. The city of Barrie annually plants around 800 large caliper trees on streets and in parks. Over the past 20 years, we've annually planted anywhere from 1,000 to 30,000 seedlings and saplings in natural areas and in parkland. Most of these are as a result of partnerships with nonprofit organizations, clubs, businesses, schools, conservation authorities, and through some grant funding as well. These projects work to increase tree canopy cover through naturalization and reforestation on public lands. While we do not have data on how many individual trees are being removed annually from private properties, certainly aware that trees do get removed from private properties for various reasons. Property maintenance, tree could be unsafe, hazardous, causing damage to homes or risk at failure. The example of the tree in the picture here. Trees get removed for construction. Could be for building a pool, extending the house, putting a secondary dwelling in. And sometimes, although probably fairly rare, sometimes trees just get removed for personal reasons. People just don't like the amount of leaves they have to remove, or they don't like the species of tree in the yard. So I presented a little bit on what our tree canopy looks like and what some of the impacts to that canopy is over time. Let's talk a little bit about tree bylaws in Ontario and what authority there is in place to regulate the removal and maintenance of trees on private properties. Section 135 of the Municipal Act provides that a municipality can prohibit or regulate the destruction or injury of trees. By around 2010, little over half of Southern Ontario was regulated under forest conservation or tree bylaws. Tree bylaws across Ontario range in type and complexity. Each municipality is able to apply the most appropriate regulations for their municipality. For example, forest conservation bylaws in upper tier municipalities are regulated under the Forestry Act. Those are regulated for woodlands of 1 hectare and larger. Tree bylaws in single and lower tier municipalities are regulated under the Municipal Act. That can include individual trees, groups of trees, or trees that are part of woodlots. Most tree bylaws have permit fees that range from under $50 per permit to greater than $2,500 per permit. Some of these bylaws require replanting as a condition of the permit. They could be replanting ratios from 1 to 1, so 1 tree planted for every tree removed, to as high as 3 or 4 to 1 in terms of 4 trees planted for each tree removed. In one case, the municipality charges the landowner the landscape appraised value of the tree to be done in either replacement planting or in compensation payment to the municipality. Tree bylaws authorized under the Municipal Act can regulate the removal or injury of single trees, multiple trees, groups of trees, or trees that are part of a woodlot. Tree bylaws can specify the size or diameter breast height of trees that are regulated under the bylaw. Tree bylaw ranges in sizes from any tree to trees of greater than 10 centimeters, trees greater than 30 centimeters, or trees greater than 50 centimeters in diameter at breast height. Examples of these on the far left, a small tree that would be over 10 centimeters in diameter could be regulated. A mature or medium-sized tree greater than 30 centimeters in diameter could be regulated, or large mature trees greater than 50 centimeters in diameter and breast height could be regulated. To give a context of what, for example, a 30 centimeter diameter breast height tree would be, is if you were to take a desk ruler, hold it out roughly at chest height up against the bole of the tree, or the trunk of the tree. If the tree is wider than the ruler, it would be in the greater than 30 centimeters diameter breast height size class. Implementation of a tree bylaw can also be either permissive or restrictive. A permissive bylaw would be one where the majority of permit applications are approved. Often these include a high replacement ratio or compensation payment for the removal, versus a restrictive bylaw that has a much lower rate of permit application removal. The applicant must demonstrate the tree is hazardous, diseased, or causing damage to the property. Alternatively, they may have to then do a high replacement planting ratio or pay a very high compensation amount for the tree if it hasn't been determined to be hazardous or requiring removal. As there are many different versions of tree bylaws across Ontario, we'll take a little bit of time to review the City of Barrie's tree bylaw relative to some of the others that are currently in place. Particularly to get some ideas of pros and cons in changing either the size of the tree regulated, permit costs, replanting costs, and all those associated costs related to it. Using the City of Barrie's example of our current bylaw, all trees that are part of a half an acre or larger woodlot are regulated. Our cost of a permit is based on cost recovery, so the administrative time for staff to review, inspect, issue permits, and generally administer the timeline of a tree permit from application through to removal and close of the permit. Obviously, we class that as a neutral administrative cost, the current one. Our enforcement cost is fairly incidental. We have anywhere from 1 to 3 investigations per year, typically not a large number. The pros of this type of a bylaw is that it protects all trees and woodlands. It is relatively low cost and doesn't have a high number of infractions per year. The cons is that it provides minimal protection for individual trees on residential properties in existing developed areas. First example of another type of tree bylaw to compare would be a multiple tree or group of tree class bylaw. So this is where a bylaw requires a permit for a certain number of trees. For this example, 3 or more trees at greater than or equal to 15 centimeters in diameter. So where a resident wanted to, or a landowner wanted to remove 1 tree or 2 trees, they would not need a permit. If they wanted to remove 3 or 4 trees that were all 15 centimeters in diameter, breast height, or larger, they would require a permit. There's two types of permit costs generally. One that is less than cost recovery, so subsidize the cost of the permit, or one that is equal to cost recovery. There also are two different requirements in terms of replanting. An example of one would be replanting at a ratio of 1 tree for every 1 tree removed, or one that does not. So comparing those to our current bylaw situation, if you were to have a cost of a permit that was below cost recovery, it would increase the tax burden cost to implement and administer the bylaw. Whereas if you were to do the tree permits at cost recovery, it would only result in a low amount of increase in relation to our current costs. Typically, these type of bylaws have a high to premium enforcement cost. The reason for that is landowners who are removing 1 or 2 trees and don't require a permit may end up having tree bylaw officers visit them to see how many they're removing as a result of residential complaints or other landowners that see activity going on. They're far more complex in terms of confusing. Can I remove 2 trees at 10 centimeters and 1 tree at 30? And is that 3 or more? You get a lot of questions, a lot of confusion in the implementation, which means a lot of site visits and a lot of calls to go out and check to see whether or not they're operating within the bylaw or not. That certainly pushes up the enforcement cost on a regular basis. Pros and cons to this type of bylaw situation. Pros would be they're relatively low cost to implement. They provide a tracking mechanism for removals, so people would have to be providing information on what they're removing. It's a flexible system for contractors and landowners to understand in terms of the numbers. The cons would be that there is an extremely low percentage of tree removals on private lands that will require a permit for removal. Owners would likely remove 1 to 2 trees per year to avoid having to get a permit. And as I discussed earlier, there would be a pretty high enforcement cost. Lots of calls in to check to see how many trees are being removed, and confirm the sizes and numbers, etc. Another example of a type of tree bylaw would be a single tree bylaw for very large diameter trees, generally considered the least regulatory. So a large tree, for example, greater than 50 centimeters in diameter would require a permit for removal. Cost of permits could be, as discussed earlier, at cost recovery or below cost recovery, which would affect the relative administrative cost. These tend to have a fairly high enforcement cost, similar to other situations where there are lots of calls coming in for tree removals on private properties as a result of the caller, concerned citizen, being unaware of what size of tree is being removed. Pros and cons of this type of bylaw: provides control over the large, significant heritage trees, usually very restrictive in terms of their removal, need to show that they are requiring removal for a safety hazard reason. Generally has a minor increase in replanting on private lands, so a tree that's being removed that's fairly large with a 1-to-1 ratio means a very small canopy replacement in the short term. Cons: the high enforcement cost to the number of calls to confirm the DBH size of a tree being removed. And this type of bylaw really only protects old heritage trees, large trees, and can result in tree removals happening ahead of reaching the size class regulation within the bylaw. Another example of a tree bylaw that regulates mature tree removal: single tree regulation for all trees greater than 30 centimeters in diameter. Generally, this has a high to premium cost for enforcement and administration, getting into a large number of trees within the municipality that would fall under this size class. And again, you're going to have some situations where callers are unaware of what size of tree is being removed, and a bylaw officer may have to attend the site to check. Pros and cons. Pros of this type of bylaw: it does provide more control over mature removals than a, say, 50 centimeter diameter bylaw. It increases the number of trees being replanted on private lands. Cons would be high administration and enforcement costs. Can result in trees being removed ahead of maturity. So some trees that are, say, 20 centimeters in diameter that are not regulated under the bylaw may get removed ahead of its reaching its size class. And this type of bylaw generally requires significant public education on how it works and why it's in place. The last example of a single tree bylaw would be one that regulates small diameter trees. So any tree that's larger than 10 centimeters in diameter, breast height, for example. This would cover the majority of trees within private lands across the city of Barrie. Both the administrative cost and enforcement costs of this type of bylaw would be at a premium and be significantly more expensive to implement than any of the other bylaws because of the sheer number of trees being regulated. Pros of this type of bylaw is it provides very strong controls over tree removals, provides a clear tracking of the number of trees removed off of private lands, can result in an increased number of trees planted on private lands as a result of either replanting compensation requirements or just general education on the importance of trees. Cons would be the highest administration costs due to the staff required to process and inspect the number of tree removal and replantings required under the bylaw. The enforcement cost is significantly high in the very first years of the bylaw, probably reducing over time as people became more aware of the requirements. And it definitely requires significant public education on the bylaw. An alternative to regulatory tree bylaws are incentive programs. These type of programs could apply to non-construction, non-development situations. A landowner would be required to submit a notice of tree removal online. No fees or permits would be required. Part of the notification could include an option for the landowner to request tree replacement. Similar to the toilet rebate program, the landowner could apply for a rebate for planting a new tree. Another option could include a private tree planting grant program. The municipality could offer grants for rebated trees that are administered by the city or a nonprofit organization. Additionally, if the municipality had a stormwater utility charge, landowners could receive rebates or reductions in the service charges based on the percentage of tree canopy on their property. This would promote tree planting and protection on private lands. A successful tree bylaw includes public education, support from landowners, nonprofit organizations, the general public, and city council, and requires adequate resources to implement. Depending on what type of tree bylaw is implemented, resources could include permit clerks, tree inspectors, urban foresters, municipal law enforcement officers, and other support staff. As part of this review, we'd like you to let us know your thoughts on tree bylaws, and particularly tree bylaws in Barrie. There is a survey that's going to open up online today under buildingbarrie.ca/trees. The survey will be online until March 11th, and the results of the survey will be summarized by staff in a report to council in early May. Thank you for your interest in trees and tree bylaws in Barrie. And we're going to move to opening the floor to questions from the audience.